Hello, everyone. My name's David Pollock. I'm the past president of the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome. And it's my pleasure today to introduce someone to you, a treat, because I think Julia Barnes is our first filmmaker, at least the first filmmaker that I'm aware of. And the first film that she made was an award-winning film called Sea of Life. And she's also made a film called Bright Green Lies. Today, we're going to focus on the perils of deep sea mining. And I pass it over now to Julia to speak about everything she's learned in the making of her films about the dangers of deep sea mining. She's a biocentric environmentalist, and I'm delighted to welcome her here today. Julia, it's over to you.
Thanks very much, David. It's great to speak to you all. And yeah, today I'm going to share a bit about deep sea mining, which has been called a gold rush and a new frontier, and also could be considered the largest ecological disaster being planned for the ocean. So the ocean is already in big trouble. 50% of the large fish have been wiped out by commercial fishing. 50% of the coral reefs have been destroyed due to a combination of ocean warming and ocean acidification primarily, but to a lesser extent, habitat destruction and pollution. Coral reefs are home to about 25% of all species in the ocean at some stage in their life cycle, so they're really key to the health of the ocean. And the ocean matters. It's not something that we necessarily think about every day, especially if we live in landlocked places. But the ocean matters for its own sake and for the species who live there, but also because it is the foundation of life on our planet. 2 out of every 3 breaths we take come from plankton in the ocean, so tiny little organisms that produce most of the planet's oxygen. And everything in the ocean is very interconnected. Plankton feed the ocean from tiny little fish all the way to blue whales. And if they're not feeding a species directly, they're probably feeding them indirectly. They are the base of the food web in the ocean. They also produce most of the oxygen for animals on land, so they could be considered one of the most important species on the planet. And this interconnection in the ocean, everything kind of evolved this balance that worked over millions of years, the balance between predators and prey, different cycles and nutrient pumps like the diel vertical migration, the exchanges of nutrients, the roles that different species play in support of the larger community. And that resulted in an ocean that was largely stable and full of life. And in a few centuries, we have so radically disrupted that balance. And really exponentially, a lot of that degradation that we've seen in the ocean has happened in the last 50, 25 years. And so I want to put this talk in the context of the fact that the ocean is already collapsing. Much of the life in the ocean has already been decimated. And so we're really at a point right now where we should be pulling back, leaving the ocean alone, allowing it to regenerate and for life to start to recover in the ocean. And I do think that that could happen. We could see an ocean that is very much more intact, that is very much more like it used to look a few hundred years ago, if we allowed for that to happen. But instead, right now, we are seeing a push to double down on exploitation of the ocean. And this is really happening across all sectors of industry that are taking place in the ocean. It's about extracting more from it, the blue economy, the rise of how do we pull a profit from the ocean. But particularly with deep sea mining, we're seeing a push to cause irreversible damage that has not been seen previously on such a large scale. And right now, we have lost 40% of the plankton. plankton upon whom all life on the planet depends. So we're really at a situation where protecting the ocean is critical, and we're going in the opposite direction with deep sea mining. So I spent 3 years making a documentary about what I thought at the time were the big issues facing the ocean. So that was from 2013 to 2006, end of 2016, 2017, when the film was released. And when I was making that documentary, I traveled to a lot of different places, learned to dive so that I could film underwater. I interviewed about 50 different scientists and ocean experts. And I went to a lot of the big climate protests that were going on at the time, with hundreds of thousands of people marching in the streets, demanding a transition to 100% clean, renewable energy. And the term green growth was being used a lot. And there was very much this idea, which still persists today, that we could continue with a lifestyle similar to what we've been accustomed to, only tweaking little things like the energy sources to become carbon free, and somehow this would be okay for the planet. And this struck me as being wrong because it wasn't addressing the deeper, more fundamental issues with the way society is set up: economic growth, extraction, overconsumption, and so on. And of course, contrary to what these solar power flowers would have you believe, solar panels don't, in fact, grow out of the ground. They require complex supply chains that harm the environment at every step of the way. And I didn't know very much at the time about the extent of that harm, but I was very curious to learn more about it. And towards the end of working on Sea of Life, I got an opportunity to interview Derek Jensen, who is one of the co-authors of the book Bright Green Lies. You heard last week from Lier, who's another co-author of that book, and next week you're going to hear from Max, who is also a co-author of that book. So they're really brilliant people. And when I heard from Derek about this book that he was working on at the time, it hadn't come out yet, called Bright Green Lies, I was really blown away by the information he was telling me, particularly because this just wasn't being talked about in the mainstream environmental movement. And it was such important information, I felt that people really needed to know about it. So that became my second documentary, made the film version of Bright Green Lies. So yeah, those are my two feature films, one about the destruction of the ocean and the other about the greenwashing and lies around renewable energy. And to me, it feels like deep sea mining is very much a convergence of these two themes. The justification that is given for wanting to rip up the deep sea and mine it for metals is that those metals could be used in electric vehicle batteries or energy storage for solar and wind. So the ocean could potentially become the largest sacrifice zone in service of this fake green image. Companies that want to exploit the deep sea claim that theirs is a gentle form of mining. And they also claim that the deep sea is a lifeless desert. Neither of these are true. The deep sea is home to an incredible diversity of life. There are magnificent species that we could never imagine. And we have little glimpses of the life in the deep sea because scientists have sent down rovers with cameras on them and taken images and videos. And also a lot of the times when they go down and collect these videos, they've got a suction tube and they collect the creatures that they come upon and bring them back to the surface as specimens, or to do something that has kind of become a buzzword lately is marine genetic resources, to attempt to extract the genetics from sea creatures to try and use for pharmaceuticals and things like that. And, you know, I personally think that the deep sea should be one of those places that's off limits to humans. I think it would be better if we just didn't know who was down there and didn't try to extract anything from it, because it is one of the last wild places we have on the planet. And I think there should be some places that are not ours, that are off limits to us. But we do have these images as a result of the fact that people have gone down there, and we can see that there's an incredible amount of diversity. Oftentimes on one expedition, they will find 1,000 species that were previously unknown to science. And these are all of the species who would be impacted if deep sea mining went ahead. And so, what are the things that they want to mine? Right now, companies are targeting something called polymetallic nodules in the abyssal plains regions of the ocean. So that's a lot of words that most people have probably not heard of before. The abyssal plains region of the ocean is characterized by long, flat stretches, plains, they're called that for a reason, that basically have this muddy, silty substrate, and polymetallic nodules, these little rock-like formations interspersed amongst them. The abyssal plains region is between 3,000 and 5,000 meters deep. And polymetallic nodules are these formations that contain multiple different types of metals. So the main metals that companies are interested in extracting from polymetallic nodules are copper, cobalt, nickel, and manganese. But there's also a bunch of other trace elements within them. And mining companies like to describe these as a battery in a rock, which is great marketing for them, but really, I don't think a good description of these at all. It's less than 3% of them generally consists of the material that they would make batteries out of. Most of it is other things. But also defining them that way makes them sound like resources. It makes them sound like they're there for us to use. But in reality, polymetallic nodules are habitats and communities in and of themselves. And the way that they form is really interesting. So it starts with a little fragment of debris, something like maybe a shark tooth that lands on the bottom of the sea, very, very deep. And over millions of years, different metals from the surrounding seawater amalgamate around these fragments of debris. So they grow incredibly slowly. They grow at a rate of 10 millimeters per million years. And some of them are 500 million years old. So they are very slow growing, very old. They're also very porous. So they have a lot of little cracks and crevices. They're about 60% porosity, and they have the surface area equivalent of 2 football fields inside of them, generally. And within all of those porous little structures inside a polymetallic nodule, there are communities of microbes living there that are much more diverse and much more dense than what exists in the surrounding seawater or the surrounding sediment. So these are really interesting for the role that they play in terms of microbial communities. And then those microbial communities, it is thought that they play a role in carbon sequestration by pulling carbon out of the seawater and through a redox reaction using some of the metals in the polymetallic nodule, locking that carbon away, sequestering it into the sediment beneath them. So really interesting, a very important function that they play in the deep sea. It's also thought that they regulate the pH, the acidity of the surrounding water, and the traces of nutrients that are in the water, the traces of metals. And so they really play a role in creating and maintaining the conditions that make the deep sea habitable for all of the species that live there. They range in size. Some of them are very small, and some of them can be quite a bit larger. And they are often the only hard substrate that species can attach to in an otherwise very muddy and silty environment. So corals, sponges, sea urchins completely depend on having polymetallic nodules to be able to attach and grow from. But also fish will come along and lay their eggs on polymetallic nodules. So a lot of species absolutely need them as habitat. They are key habitat. And an interesting thing about corals and sponges in the deep sea, they have incredibly long lifespans. So corals in the deep sea can live to be 4,000 years old, and sponges in the deep sea can live to be 11,000 years old. Just amazing to think about, and also horrifying to think that a mining company going down there would be wiping out an individual who has lived for 11,000 years. This is a little diagram that pretty well explains the process of deep sea mining that is being proposed. So companies want to lower machines to the seafloor from a ship at the surface. These machines have been called house-sized, which is pretty accurate. They would be 40 feet by 20 feet by 16 feet. So absolutely enormous machines that would be driving along the seabed and extracting, sucking up everything in their path, including polymetallic nodules, but also some of the sediment that's down there, and of course the life that is in their way that can't get out of their way. What the companies are planning on doing is crushing the materials at depth to make it a little bit easier to then send them up through a riser pipe to a ship on the surface that is attached to. There would then be some initial processing that goes on the ship to separate the polymetallic nodule bits that they want from the debris, sediments, and anything else that was brought up that they don't want. And then the materials that they don't want would be dumped back into the ocean. There are companies that are thinking of pumping it down somewhere in the midwater zone. We don't know yet exactly where this material would end up. No companies, as far as I know, are planning to pump it all the way back to the deep sea. They're planning to release it quite a bit higher in the water column, but it's possible that some companies may just dump it at the surface. We really don't know what they would actually end up doing. But regardless of where the plume is released, there will be incredible amounts of sediment being pumped into the ocean 24/7 as these mining operations are going on. And it would not just be one ship and one mining machine. We're talking tens or maybe hundreds of these operating simultaneously if deep sea mining really gets going. And the sediment plumes that are created are absolutely devastating to fish. So anyone who breathes through gills, so fish, some sharks who are swimming through this area, and the area they're planning on mining is a migratory pathway for a lot of different species. When they breathe in the sediment from deep sea mining, it gets into their gills, damages their breathing, or suffocates them outright. So this is something that is considered toxic to fish. It is an absolute disaster for them to have to swim through this. And for those who don't suffocate immediately, there would be heavy metals and things like that that could potentially bioaccumulate through the food web that would also be released in this plume. And at depth, of course, there's also going to be a plume that's created, and that would bury in some other organisms who are not in the exact zone that's being mined, but in the vicinity wherever this picks up and eventually travels to. So that's a major issue with deep sea mining that people are very concerned about, is these plumes of sediment. And there are currents in the ocean that would take these hundreds of kilometers away outside of the minings. Like it would spread and spread. Like it's not something that's just going to stay in one little area. But in the next few slides, you're going to see that the area is not small either that they're planning on mining. So yeah, we've got disturbance from noise and light, obviously direct destruction of habitat. Species extinction is considered a likely outcome of deep sea mining. Also, the increased acidification of the seawater in the deep sea, because what is being stirred up is essentially carbon, and it's the carbon being absorbed into the upper layers of the ocean that is causing the acidification there. And that is already having huge, huge impacts and huge problems for marine life in the upper regions of the ocean. So we could potentially see the deep sea becoming acidified as well. Another study recently found that there would be radioactive waste because there is some level of radioactivity in polymetallic nodules. So again, as those are being crushed and the waste material is being spewed into the ocean, we could see an increase in radioactivity in the ocean in general. Increased carbon emissions, increased turbidity, which affects plankton, could affect plankton and their ability to grow, depending what level of the ocean this material is released at, and altering geochemical processes that underpin life in the ocean. So the deep sea is actually the planet's largest active carbon sink. It is incredibly important in terms of its ability to sequester carbon. And stirring it up with deep sea mining could, well, not only release a lot of carbon back into the seawater, but also permanently damage the ability of the deep sea to sequester carbon. And also removing the nodules and knowing about the role that they play in the carbon cycle, that's not something that's going to come back. That function would be permanently removed. So this is a little video from a NOAA expedition. So this is a small machine on the seabed, and I'm going to play it for you just so you can get a sense of how easy it is to stir up sediment in the deep sea, in the abyssal plains. This machine is just moving a little bit and you'll see the plume come up, a lot lighter than any mining machine that they're intending to use. And something that's important to know is that sediment from the deep sea, it's not sand. And a lot of the modeling that was commissioned by mining companies uses sand as a modeling material, but sand is heavier and it tends to sink, whereas the fine particulate matter that is stirred up from the deep sea is much lighter and can actually remain suspended in the water column for months or even years at a time. The area that they are planning on mining is that big oval in the middle of the screen called the Clarion-Clipperton Zone. It is located between Hawaii and Mexico, and if all of the mines that are being planned for that area go ahead, it would be the largest contiguous mining area on the planet. It's about as wide as the US. This is a close-up of kind of how they've divvied up the different areas that have exploration mining permits or licenses, and these are what would be expected to roll over into exploitation permits. So the areas in yellow are actually considered reserved areas, but obviously a lot of them are right next to mining sites, and I think it would be absurd to think that they would not be impacted by the sediment plumes that are stirred up from deep sea mining. So to call them protected, I think is really not going to be the case. So the Clarion-Clipperton Zone is just one area that contains these polymetallic nodules, but all of the green spots on this map are other parts of the ocean that contain polymetallic nodules. So other areas that could also potentially be targeted by mining. And that is just one form of deep sea mining, and that's the one that, you know, a lot of my work has focused on it because it's closest to actually getting underway in a commercial sense. So there's a bit more urgency with stopping that form of deep sea mining. But there are other forms of deep sea mining being considered as well. So there are cobalt-rich crusts that companies are interested in targeting, and there's also hydrothermal vents. So this map shows some of those different areas. So really large swaths of the ocean. And when you consider how interconnected everything is in the ocean, something taking place in one area like the Clarion-Clipperton Zone is not going to stay in the Clarion-Clipperton Zone. It's going to have ripple out effects that really affect the whole ocean system. Recently, one of the mining companies did a test mine or an exploratory mining operation where they lowered a quarter size replica, quarter of the size of the mining machine that they intend to use. And they tried deep sea mining out. The company is called the Metals Company. They are headquartered in Vancouver, although their headquarters is really just a mailbox. They don't actually work there. And they pulled 3,000 tons of polymetallic nodules out of the deep sea. And when I look at this picture, I think about how much time it took for those to form and how much, spread across the ocean floor, the area of habitat that was, and all the life that would have been in the way of the machines. And I find it really horrifying just seeing this image, and then even worse to think that this is just a fraction of the mining that they intend to do if they were to do this commercially. A tiny, tiny fraction. One thing that happened when they came out during this, or after they did this test mine, is that some of the scientists who were on board anonymously reported to Greenpeace, and then Greenpeace put this out in a press release, that so basically they were gathering a lot of data during this test mining, and this data was meant to inform future decisions regarding the environmental impacts of deep sea mining. It was meant to provide kind of a baseline, kind of a simulation for what we could expect. And a couple of the scientists who were on board there reported that they were told by the Metals Company to take their samples in the clear water outside of the area where there was a plume. And so kind of the idea being that they were asked to fudge their data, which, is quite alarming that would be going on. So that's what they said in their statements and their press release. And apparently there was a sediment plume, but the samples were not taken from there. But I read some news media interviews with a spokesperson from the Metals Company saying there were no plumes created when we did our mining. And so, yeah, gotta take that with a grain of salt, I guess. So the Metals Company is by far not the only company that is looking at deep sea mining. And this is another prototype from a Belgian company, which is DEME is the name of the company. And so they are also at pretty much the same stage of getting ready and being quite close to being able to do commercial deep sea mining. So yeah, it's something that's very much creeping up on us, that this could become a reality, to have machines all over ripping up the ocean floor. And recently there was a meeting of the International Seabed Authority, which was of great interest to anyone who has been following the issue of deep sea mining, because 2 years prior to that meeting, Nori, which is a Nauru-based deep sea mining company, was actually a subsidiary of the Metals Company, triggered what is known as the 2-year rule, which is an obscure clause in the International Law of the Sea that would require the International Seabed Authority, the regulatory body on deep sea mining, to come up with regulations within 2 years or allow deep sea mining to take place. So everybody was very interested to see what they would do at this meeting. And what they ended up doing was saying that they're not going to come up with draft regulations until 2025. So they put it off, and it's still very, very close in time. But in the meantime, they will be accepting mining applications. We don't know whether they're going to actually permit any companies to mine in the deep sea, but I guess the door is left open that they could. So really, any day, deep sea mining, commercial mining could begin in international waters. So that's the situation that we're at right now in terms of the regulatory system around deep sea mining. So I think there are 3 most likely ways that deep sea mining could be prevented. One of them is if we have a serious economic collapse or downturn that makes it not economically viable for them to mine the deep sea. And if that happens relatively quickly before deep sea mining gets underway. The other is if there was some kind of campaign like the Save the Whales campaign, like a Paul Watson style direct confrontation, people going out there and getting in the way of the mining vessels or sinking the ships or something like that. Or the other option would be for enough countries to support a ban or a moratorium at the International Seabed Authority. And in advance of the recent meeting at the ISA this July, there were 21 countries that supported a ban, moratorium, or temporary pause on deep sea mining, which is great, except that there are 167 member countries of the ISA, plus the EU. So really not a large percentage of them that came out in support of a moratorium. But potentially those numbers could increase before the next ISA meeting or before the regulations are finalized. So that's one option, and I think that's where a lot of the efforts of people who are trying to prevent deep sea mining might go, is to figuring out which countries are kind of on the edge of wanting to support a moratorium and then trying to nudge them in the right direction. Something that has been a big issue for those of us who want to stop deep sea mining is just that this is something that is so little known. Like recently, it's been a bit more, there's been some coverage in major news outlets, and I think more people are starting to understand that deep sea mining is coming or might be coming. But before then, it was something that most people had not heard of, and people just can't fight against something if they don't know that it's even happening. So yeah, a big part of what I've been working on the last couple of years is like talking to people about deep sea mining. I made a short film about deep sea mining, and pretty much across the board, when I talk to people about it, when I show people that film, they think deep sea mining is a bad idea and they don't want to see it happen. And that's good news. I think if more people knew about this, they would also not want to see it happen. But at the same time, still, I think most people aren't really aware of deep sea mining, and we need a lot more people to care and to get actively involved if we're going to shut this down. Because, yeah, the deep sea is this area of the world that has been relatively untouched by humans. Like, yes, there's plastic pollution reaching the deep sea, and it's somewhat starved of nutrients because we have decimated life in the upper areas of the ocean, which would normally be a food source through marine fall for the deep sea. But aside from that, the deep sea is relatively left alone, and it's an area that is allowed to do its own thing and be one of the last truly wild places on our planet. And I think that's really important to have, and that could all change very soon. So we're at a point right now where this could be a huge disaster that's coming on down the line, or we could avert it, and we still do have a chance to stop deep sea mining before it happens. And, you know, unfortunately, we have this extra thing that we have to stop, right? Like deep sea mining on top of ocean acidification and industrial fishing and all of these other extractive activities that are happening on the planet. It's like, we've got enough to deal with already. We certainly didn't need this to come along and also be a thing that we had to put our effort towards stopping. But that's where we're at. And I think if we could stop deep sea mining, that would be a huge win. We would be preventing possibly the greatest ecological disaster this planet has ever, I don't want to say ever seen. We've had mass extinctions in the past, and we're going through one right now. But this would be, in recent times, the largest disturbance to the ocean. And, you know, it's a very small amount of people right now that are making decisions, that are pursuing this, that are doing something that is going to affect all future generations, just so that a few people right now can make a profit. an enormous profit potentially. But deep sea mining is not good for the climate. It's quite the opposite. It could really exacerbate the climate crisis and destroy one of our best carbon sinks that we depend on without really thinking about it very much. And it could really wreck the ocean in ways that I don't think we can ever fully understand unless it happens. We can't let it happen. So that is my presentation. Yeah, back to you, David, for questions.
Julia, thank you very, very much. I was surprised how abruptly it came to an end because I was just following each word and thought that you had expressed. There's a number of people who are up. I'm going to, in a moment, I'm going to ask the first question, and then I'm going to call on Anitra. I think she's back. Will be the next person up after my question. My question, Julia, given that this information is not widely known, I was just thinking, if you were doing a presentation to President Biden about this, the first thing I would do if I were President Biden afterwards is I would get on the phone and I would talk to the director of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, the Woods Hole Institute. And I would ask him, you know, how much can he validate the kind of things that were in your film or that you've presented here today? And in terms of a campaign, I'm wondering, have you yet or are you intending to try to round up responses and or support from some of the highly credited institutions such as Woods Hole that exist around the world? So just your thoughts about how one goes about gathering the credible sources to advance the campaign that you're working on.
Yeah, that's a good question. So one thing that I think I should mention is that there have been, I think, over 600 scientists and marine policy experts who signed on to a joint statement, basically in support of a moratorium on deep sea mining, which might not sound like a large number, but like getting scientists to all agree on something and to like people who's oftentimes the funding for the research that they want to do kind of comes from the companies that want to do the mining. So that was a pretty big deal. And like David Attenborough has supported a moratorium on deep sea mining. Sylvia Earle, who is really preeminent marine scientist, has supported a moratorium on deep sea mining. So definitely that kind of support exists. And yeah, that's a good idea to look at those kind of institutions. It does get tricky sometimes in those situations because like, yeah, a lot of times there's a lot of good funding for research if it has to do with, it's coming from the mining companies and it's about, they often work with like universities and institutions to study the mining. So there's some like partnerships there. Yeah.
Thanks, Julia, for that. I'm going to call next on Ted. He's on deck right after Anitra. So Anitra, you're muted, Anitra. Anitra, you are muted.
Now I'm not muted anymore. Thank you, Julia, for a most illuminating and beautifully illustrated talk. I find it a little, for my own purposes, a little light on the metrics, and would like some concepts, for instance, on the scale of the amount of deep sea bottom that might be impacted in the next 40 years compared to the total ocean bottom, and only by these large companies that are going to go in for, as you say, the cobalt, copper, manganese, and so forth. Do you have any of those numbers at all?
So yeah, I have a number for in the Clarion Clipperton zones. I'm not looking at cobalt crusts or any of these other types of mining, but just this one area that they're currently targeting for mining. It would be the permits that are currently issued, so there's 31 permits, covers 400,000 square miles. of the Clarion-Clipperton Zone. So that's just the direct seabed area, though obviously the kind of larger impacts and concerns around deep sea mining have more to do with where the plumes will travel and the life that will be impacted in those areas.
And my second, and I think perhaps more relevant question is, what are the countries doing which are in the direct impact zones, and how are they insisting that industry, as they can and will do with many different industries such as petroleum or atomic energy or some other industry, find many of their own solutions to this slag and to the turbidity and to the displacement, and therefore to the mitigation, which has to be done afterwards. What responsibility has been given and what is ongoing that's going to regenerate or cut vastly down on the amount of pollution?
So the draft regulations have not been made yet, so we really don't know how the pollution is going to be handled, or if there will be stipulations about, like, they're talking about stipulating what depth they can pump the waste material to. So potentially they would say it has to be below 1,000 meters or something like that, which obviously still highly problematic considering the way everything moves and flows in the ocean. But yeah, that's something that potentially they're thinking about regulating. But yeah, I don't see that there's really a way that deep sea mining can be done in a way that it should be done. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think there's ever going to be a gentle enough way to do it. I mean, we're talking about, even if all of the issues with sediment and everything go away, I mean, why are we doing this, right? Like, for a few people to make a lot of profit. They claim that the metals will be used in electric car batteries and solar panel storage, which may or may not be true. They may also be used for primarily cell phone batteries and electronic gadgets like computers and whatnot. But even if it's used for electric vehicles or solar panels, none of that is stuff that helps the planet. That's all just stuff that's adding to you know, the continued destruction and exploitation of the planet. I don't see any of those as things that we should want to contribute to or help support. I don't think we should be getting battery minerals from anywhere, whether that's lithium mines in Nevada or the deep sea. Like, we don't need these metals. I was talking to a woman in Tonga, one of the countries, or one of the island nations that's going to be impacted more directly from deep sea mining, and she was saying, we need the ocean, we need the air, we don't need the car. Like, we forget, and we've gotten so used to the way that we live, we tend to think it'll just keep going like this. But car culture is a relatively new invention, and not one that I think can last if we're going to live on this planet continuing into the
Julia,
future.
thank you for that. I'm going to ask John Legg to be on deck for a question, but I'll turn to Ted Manning now for question or comment.
Julia, those photos were absolutely fabulous. Thank you very much for bringing them. It's very clear that there's going to be immense political pressure to replace fossil fuels somehow. And the real issue is, can the system deal with where we get whatever replaces them? So I'm not sure it's fair to ask you the question, but probably everybody here, which is, what is the alternative if we have to get off fossil fuels? And we don't appear to be able to go totally off any fuels, because we kind of like to stay alive. So the next question is, what can we do? And if we are going to have to get something else than fossil fuels, it does appear that electrifying a great deal of how we get our energy for anything, even if it's not cars. So as I said, I think I can see a very big demand happening. Are there, in fact, realistic alternatives that are easier on the ecosystem than the deep sea mining?
So, not going to be an answer that anyone wants to hear. No. I mean, that's what I think. I don't think that electrifying things is going to be any kind of solution. I think we really need to look at changing the way that we live and just dramatically reducing the consumption of energy as a whole.
Means leaving Canada, then. We've got to head south.
Well,
And
people lived here for a long time before there was any such thing as electricity. So yeah, I think we need to really
essentially
radically change
what is habitable changes immensely if we have absolutely no external energy.
I think
Thank you very much.
I think we'll move to John Legg, and Dave Doherty, you're on deck following John Legg's comment. Go ahead, John.
Thank you, David. And Julia, I echo other sentiments of appreciation for your presentation. Mine has a little bit to do with international influence in international discussions about law of the sea. And from memory, between about 20 to 40 years ago, Canada was disproportionately influential in these discussions, and they took many forms in many areas. That is, law of the sea discussions. Our outstanding official at that time was an eminent international lawyer by the name of Alan Beasley. And my question to you is, do you have any feel for how well or poorly Canada is respected in those circles, that is, law of the sea discussions these days?
I honestly don't know. I don't know how Canada is perceived in the law of the sea discussions. I do know that they eventually came around to supporting a moratorium at the ISA, so that was good news. But yeah, I don't know what influence they have there.
It was in two main areas that come to mind where we were very active and took positions which were seen as leading positions, and one was in the whole gigantic area of the Cold War. And so whatever contests ideologically and politically we were involved in with the USSR, Russia, whichever you wish, and the other one that was in the Arctic in general. And that was because of our presence in the Arctic and our activities. So it would show up in those areas, but these days, according to your presentation, one area of concern is, of course, deep sea mining, but there are many others. And I throw out one last warning, and that it's nothing original here, but when a country such as China builds an island and then bases its claims on territorial seas around its building of that island, things are getting a little bit out of hand. I just throw these thoughts out for you to, if you want to, I don't know whether you have any views on those areas.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't really know enough about it, but yeah, thanks for sharing that.
So thank you, John. I think Samrat, I'd like to recognize you right after Dave Doherty. So you're on deck with either a question or comment, and now turning to Dave Doherty.
Yeah, mine's really just a comment. I've put a half a dozen links in the chat to various things that you mentioned, Julia, such as the scientists' criticism of the proposal to do deep sea mining. related to what John was just pointing out, one of the things that's mentioned is that Canada is among the 21 countries that are currently supporting a ban, moratorium, or precautionary pause in deep sea mining. I think, however, it's probably fair to say that governments in Canada have been very much supportive of economic growth. We've got a prime minister now who says basically we've got all this oil and gas and we're sure not going to ignore it. And I think it's very likely that we will join the group who advocates for the commercial exploitation because there's so much profit to be made.
Thanks, Dave. Raymond Lurie, you're up next with your question, but first we'll turn now to Samrat. Samrat?
Yeah, you can hear me, I hope.
Indeed.
Yeah, thanks so much, Julia, for making the presentation. Amazing. I think you already answered my question, which was more like a simple thing that you feel that deep sea mining is not sustainable, not ecological. If you can just encapsulate that further, that'll be great. Thanks.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess one thing that I didn't mention in the presentation but comes up a lot is that mining companies will often position this as being really sustainable because they compare, right? So they say we can mine the deep sea or we can mine on land and cut down rainforests and destroy these ecosystems on land. And they say, oh, deep sea mining is so much better because there's not that much life down there or something. And I would like to highlight the fact that that is such a false choice that they have set up right there, because no one is going to close down mines or stop expanding mines terrestrially just because they go out and they start mining in the deep sea. Like, this is just going to be an addition, a new type of mining on top of the other mining that's already going on or already being planned. So yeah, the way that mining companies try and frame it is always, you know, us versus them, this is better. But that's not how it works in the real world. It's just an additional issue that then the environment is going to have to deal with. So, and especially because the demand for these metals is expected to be essentially infinite. And so, yeah, I think deep sea mining couldn't be farther from being sustainable or good for the planet. We're talking about I mean, really, like the numbers of fish who swim through those areas who are going to suffocate because they are breathing in sediment plumes. Like, it would be such a loss of life for the ocean. And it would be the loss of the carbon sink would be essentially permanent damage to something that is so essential to the functioning of the planet. It seems like a terrible, terrible idea.
Right. Thanks so much for encapsulating that. Yeah.
Thank you, Samrat, for your question, comment. And I'm going to go to Raymond Lurie, but on deck will be Claude Buetner. So Claude, you're on deck next. And now over to you, Raymond.
Hi, Julia. Thanks for the presentation. One of the things that I'm concerned about is, and I've got it in here, is trawling and trawling of the bottom of the seas. It seems to me that there's already probably tens of thousands of trawlers that are scraping the bottom of the earth, the bottom of the ocean all the time. So, are these plumes you're talking about any different, or are they any worse than what the trawlers are doing right now?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, bottom trawling is a real big issue. But the areas that they trawl for fish are usually quite a bit more shallow than the areas that they're thinking of mining in the abyssal plains region. So like 3,000 meters deep, there would not normally be any trawling for fish there. So they're just not going to catch enough, or the types of species that people like to eat. So it's a very different area of the ocean, and it's a different composition of sediment. So the bottom of the ocean, somewhere where they're trawling for fish, might have more sand in it, or kind of coral, gravelly stuff. It would be a different makeup. Whereas what exists on the seabed in the deep sea is this fine particulate matter that is created by marine snow, essentially. So it's the feces or the bodies of organisms further up in the ocean that sink and then are eaten and decomposed by organisms in the deep sea. So it's just, yeah, it's a different material that would be stirred up, and it would certainly be more disturbed than something that is trawling for fish generally isn't trying to stir up or snag on things on the bottom. Whereas if you're talking about mining, we're talking about disturbing like quite a bit down into the sediment layer to get everything out of it. So yeah, it's a kind of a different thing.
Yeah, thank you.
In a moment, I'm going to call on Claude, but before I do, I wanted to say we're at the end of the first round. So if there are people who are watching who want to signal just with a Q or a C in the chat box before I go into any second round, please let me know. But for now, we'll just move right to Claude. So Claude, your question, I think you had two.
Yes, thank you so much, Julia, for a wonderful presentation and a very spirited Q&A here as well. So my two-part question, the first part is really quite open-ended. How does overshoot denial affect the debate over this type of mining? And my second question is more technical. Have they thought about using AI-driven water drones instead of that massive machine down there with the tracks? It looks like it weighs tens of tons, if not more. So intuitively, a water drone could use sonar, for example, even within turbid water to find the largest nodules and bring them up to a collection point. And that would certainly minimize the total destruction that appears to take place when a tracked vehicle comes over.
That's an interesting question. So I don't know. So I'll start with the last one. I don't know if the industry has thought about using those kinds of different methods. I would imagine that from their point of view, it would just be a lot more efficient and cost efficient to have their big mining machines that are able to just, you know, scoop through these large areas and get a whole bunch of things and to go and collect individually and bring it up and down. But yeah, I don't know. That might be something that they're thinking about. Still, you're losing the nodules themselves, which are really important habitat. So I wouldn't personally consider that a good option, but yeah, that might be something they're thinking about. So in terms of overshoot denial, I mean, I think this is just such a great example of overshoot in general, that they're thinking of mining the deep sea for metals. Like, it just shows that they've blown through everything that's easily accessible on land, that they would even think that this was a good idea, right? And obviously it's quite difficult. It's quite costly to mine the deep sea. So to me, it like demonstrates brilliantly where we're at in terms of overshoot. But denial of that, certainly, I mean, there seems to be this idea that you can keep mining and keep expanding into new places and not, there seems to be no acknowledgement of the fact that we're having to move into these new places because things are finite. Like, there's just this idea we'll never run out. Oh, we'll mine the moon next, or we'll start mining asteroids, or yeah, it's all pretty nuts. Yeah, failure to acknowledge that we're on a finite planet.
Thank you, Claude, for those questions. Art, why don't you ask your question? And this would bring us to the end of our questions, but I'm not opposed to people having a second question if it's pertinent. But Art, you next, please.
Yeah, Julia, once again, I did comment earlier that I read your slides, and there were I think this presentation was the one with the fewest words that of the 162 that we've had, and I compliment you on that. And of course, your dialogue that went with them was excellent. One thing that did strike me was the role of the United Nations, and because this matter, I presume, has been discussed at the General Assembly and perhaps elsewhere as well. What is their position on deep sea mining? Are they supportive of your cause?
So I don't think that the UN has taken a position on deep sea mining, but the International Seabed Authority, which is the regulator of deep sea mining, was set up by the UN. So it's kind of a quasi-UN organization. And it was set up with the dual mandate of protecting the international seabed and facilitating mining. So clearly, I would say a conflict there. But yeah, I mean, I would assume that given that the ISA is a subset of the UN, that they would be in line with each other. But I have no idea. I've not spoken to anyone at the UN, so I don't know how they feel about that.
And Dave Doherty, you have a question that Jean Doherty wished to ask. I guess she's not online. So Dave, go ahead again. Oh, Dave or Jean.
We're in the same room.
I can see that face is not the one I recognize as Dave Doherty's, but please go ahead, Jean, with your question. Julia, Jean's the chair of the board of KCAR. Go ahead, Jean.
Thank you, David. And Julia, thank you for a very enlightening presentation. It was very interesting. As a geologist, one of the things that we learn as we're going through all of the work that we're doing is how to go about getting the rights to do things like mining and exploration and all of that sort of thing. And there's exchange of money in the hands of people, the royalties that are being paid so that things can be done. So what, in the case of deep sea mining, because it's in international waters, what do they do with this kind of thing? And is it just money up for, or is it just up for grabs? Does anybody control it? And what can we do when a country like China decides that they're going to do it anyway?
So right now they all appear to be, at least in international waters, playing by the rules of the International Seabed Authority. I think China is one of the countries that also has some permits there, some exploration permits. But then obviously within countries' exclusive economic zones, they can do whatever they want. So I think some countries are already doing deep sea mining, different forms like diamond mining, but they're doing that in their own territorial waters. But in terms of the royalties and how that works. So it's interesting because the high seas or the international seabed is considered the common heritage of mankind. A lot of people have started saying humankind instead for obvious reasons. But yeah, so there's sort of this expectation of some kind of like everyone has to benefit, some kind of sharing of the profits that come from that. But the majority of the profits are going to be going towards the companies that are engaging in the mining activities. Otherwise, there's no incentive for them to do it. And then, yeah, there'll be some money left over that I guess gets shunted into this is for the benefit of humankind part of it. How that would be distributed, and I mean, I think it would end up like if you literally gave a cut of that to every human, it would be like piddly, like it wouldn't be anything anyone would get excited about. So I have no idea what they're planning on doing with that. I do know that the structure of the International Seabed Authority, they're set up to be somewhat funded by mining royalties. So part of it is also going to go towards funding that regulatory body, which obviously has raised some concern about like, again, yeah, if they're funded by mining, then they might lean towards wanting it to happen.
I think, Jean, before we ask you to thank Julia, our speaker today, I just wanted to ask Vic Buxton, you're familiar with some of the law of the sea negotiations. Do you have a comment on some of the conversation that just preceded this, Vic?
Yes, I do. I have some background on it. I was not involved personally in the negotiation, but I was involved in the discussion Canada-wise at the beginning of the 70s that led up to it. And I think one has to appreciate is what was the driving force for the law of the sea in the first place? And how it was described is this: oceans are the property of all, therefore the responsibility of none. And that philosophical point of view still holds. At that point in time, there was various countries that refused to join in because they had a future idea that there was mineral content in their waters. And the other driver was the sort of depletion of the fishing resource, because people could fish right, in the Grand Banks, as long as they were more than 12 miles away from the coast. And so I think what we need as a resolution to this issue that's before us is we have to go back and accept the premise again that property of all is the responsibility of none. And we have to create international means of addressing this. In the absence of this, there's no way we're going to stop them. And especially if there's no mandatory requirement to stop them. Anyway, Julie, I know you don't have a background in that area, but if you have any insights on how we can go to the next steps, or John Legg at the international, because this is an international problem. This is not a domestic issue, or a country-bound issue, and it's not going to be solved because there will always be renegade states that refuse to accept whatever's going on.
Thanks for your reflection, Vic. I'm going to take two final questions and then I'll pass it over to Jean. So Claude has a second question. I'll maybe just ask it, or would you like to, Claude, go again?
No, that's fine. And I think it actually was addressed, but
the question about
succinctly.
a nodule tax, that question?
Yes.
Okay. So then let's go to Art. Art, you get the last question today.
All right. Just thinking about the dwell time of these plumes, clearly they don't stay suspended forever, and there's particle size, and I imagine the heavier parts would settle out before the finer parts, and the ocean is, of course, not sitting there idle. It is in constant motion, and there's turbulence and ocean currents and temperature effects and what all. I imagine there's quite a number of variables that are at play here. Have there been any major studies that have been done that try and address this problem of how long it takes for the plume to cease to be an issue?
Mm-hmm. So all we have essentially at this point is modeling, because this has not been done, well, obviously, like in real life in the ocean. But there was, I'm trying to think of what it was called, because there's a video that was done about this. And so, yeah, if anyone wants to see, they kind of showed where the plume would travel and, yeah, for how far it would spread out. And I think if you type in deep sea mining campaign, that's the organization that put it on. You could probably find it from there. And but yeah, like in terms of how long the sediment stays suspended, the finer particles, it can be months or years that they stay suspended in the water column. And yeah, currents will take them quite a bit further than the mining area. But yeah, I mean, the thing is, like, if the mining goes ahead, then it will be operating essentially, it will be operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for like maybe 30 years, right? So the stuff from when they first started mining maybe stays suspended for a month and then settles, but there's constantly new stuff being pumped into the ocean and added. So for the purposes of the ocean creatures, it's going to be like a constant inundation of this, right, for as long as the mining is going on. It's not like a one-off thing. Okay, we've mined this area, it took a week, and then we wait 2 months and then all of the sediment is gone. It would be constantly being re-inundated with that material for as long as, the 30 years that it takes them to fully vacuum out the area. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And Julia, thanks again, and Art for your question. And over to you, Jean.
Thank you, David. And Julia, it is indeed my pleasure to get the opportunity to thank you on behalf of Canadian Association for the Club of Rome. You have given a really enlightening discussion and talk about a subject that we really don't think too much about when it comes to issues associated with the problems that are facing humanity. So this has been really, really an interesting presentation. And thank you very much for taking your time to give us this talk today.
Thanks so much for having me.
And for those of you who are still online, if you are interested in seeing this presentation again with her beautiful photographs and so on, go to canadiancore.com, our website, And if you log into the Stay Informed section of our website, you actually will get the link to this particular presentation and the ability to check for all of the other Zoom presentations that we have had over the course of the last few years. So it's a really interesting and a very deep source of information for people. So again, you can look at this at any time. Also on our website, you can find information about becoming a member of the club KCOR, and also in terms of if you're interested in supporting our work, you can find ways in which you can donate to our organization. So I strongly recommend that you go to canadiancore.com and look for all the information that you need for this. And again, Julia, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation.